Hello and welcome to the channel and welcome to this long overdue video. It took a lot of time to do. Very sorry for that, and I hope you'll enjoy what I've produced. So look, the 7th and 8th February marked the anniversary of the Battle of Eylau, and because of that I had to present something this weekend. So you know that by the title I'm going to talk about the heavy cavalry sabre, the French heavy cavalry sabre. But let's make things more interesting and let me get into character now. Fear not, this is currently a work in progress, so there are still some adjustments to be made, but it will do for now because I'm going to focus not on the helmet and the armor itself, but rather on the sword that I have on my lap, and is something that many of you collectors and lovers or enthusiasts of the Napoleonic Wars are going to recognize instantly as being the sabre for the heavy cavalry or the line cavalry model year 13 or 11. But before I talk about the sword itself, I think it would be relevant to talk about the men themselves, the Cuirassiers. Of all the units of the Napoleonic Wars, the Cuirassiers are amongst the most widely known and recognized due to their appearance. Highly trained and disciplined, their primary purpose was, when used accordingly, to be engaged in battle at the right moment as the decisive blow, by making contact with a weakened enemy and routing it. The nature of this tactical role meant they were kept in the back as reserves and deployed only when necessary to avoid wasting their numbers, because they were not cheap or easy to train. Much like the famed Imperial Guard, they were precious, hardly expendable, and gained a fearsome reputation during the wars. Other great powers such as Austria, Russia, Prussia, and some of the bigger German states had cuirassiers, but these were not equipped and they were not used the same way, which made all the difference in understanding why the French heavy cavalry was more successful in its actions, why it was therefore remembered and emulated even after the empire fell. Among the many things that the cuirassiers were copied for, its armament and equipment are the main elements, though I will present the cuirass and the helmet in a future video. So in this one I will focus on one thing that the trooper considered to be his one true weapon, the sword. But first, let's talk a bit about the men themselves. The creation of the cuirassier officially started in October 10, 1801, after Bonaparte realized the usefulness of massed cavalry at the Battle of Marengo. He ordered the conversion of the 25 regiments of cavalry, 7 régiments de cavalerie, who acted as the heavy cavalry during the Revolutionary Wars, despite being anything but armored troops, and their uniform and equipment wasn't so different from the dragoons, except for the headgear and the tactical use. Of these regiments, only the 8th wore the cuirass and backplate since its creation in 1638 as the Cuirassiers du Roi. For this, the unit was the only one that was termed as Cavalry Cuirassiers. In October 1801, these 25 regiments were reshuffled and reduced to 12 units, with the 1st and the 8th Cuirassiers being the senior regiments that formed together the 1st Brigade. A year later, numbers 2, 3, and 4 were raised on the 12th of October. Then the 5th, 6th, 7th, 9, 10, 11, and 12th regiments appeared on December of that same year. It was one thing to create new units was another to fully equip them. And except for the 8, the cuirass and then later on the helmets were started to be issued to the units only after 1802. The 1/3 of them were equipped in 1803, the second in 1804, and the last third in 1805. So it took 4 years to complete the conversion of cavalry to cuirassiers, and this was done in secrecy by order of Napoleon, as these new units were considered to be a secret weapon to hide from the enemy intelligence. Of course, all this reorganization came with a new sabre that followed, which was known as the Heavy Cavalry Sword model of the year 9. If you remember what I said in my previous video, the year 1800 saw the introduction of a series of new sword models as part of a reform of the French military equipment, which was under the supervision of General Gassendi. The sabre for light cavalry that came out of it was kind of a new design because its shape differed greatly from previous models. Not so much was the case with the sabre for the heavy cavalry, because it was the continuation of a previous group of swords who shared similar morphology. The shape of the hilt, for example, was greatly influenced by the 1776 sword for the King's Garde du Corps, and the model 1784 for the dragoons that was made with a type of blade that had 2 fullers. The year 9 sabre was adopted in 1801, or year 10, in the earliest form, having the following features: a brass hilt with 3 outer branches that connected with the knucklebow without touching the barrel-shaped pommel. The grip was made of a wood core wrapped with black leather and reinforced with approximately 12 turns of twisted brass wire that had a thickness of 0.8 millimeters. The scabbard was made of iron, having a guitar-shaped drag and 2 flattened suspension rings. Unlike the previous dragoon models 1779/84, the blade was triangular flat without any folders and having a straight back point. The sword had 2 major problems. The flat blade was too heavy, unbalanced, but also fragile. And the scabbard was found to be just as unreliable, bending or breaking easily, sometimes trapping the blade inside. These observations brought in a bigger problem: the long-term cost of repairs. So the Minister of War Berthier met the Artillery Committee in the year 11 to remedy these flaws. And approximately a year later, in 1802, year 11, the new reworked sword was presented as the sabre pattern year 11, having a solid but lighter blade which had reverted back to the 2 fullers of the dragoon models. Aside from being attractive, the fullers also increased solidity to the blade while simultaneously removing weight. The other change was made to the grip with the addition of a brass ferrule that kept the grip together more easily than lone wire. Another subtle change was with the outer branches, which connected to the knucklebow but also the pommel. And the last change was made to the scabbard, which was of stronger yet heavier iron thickness, reinforced with glued wooden inserts, and the rings were made round for better resistance. The standard or average length of the sword itself would be approximately 113 centimeters, the blade being 97.5 centimeters. The sword's weight was on average 1.4 kilograms, while the scabbard itself was 1.3 kilograms on average. So the whole thing's weight was approximately 2.75 kilograms. This revised sword was presented and accepted in the year 11, but it was only officially confirmed and adopted later on in the year 13 via official documents. And this was the Règlement des armes portatives du 1er Vendémiaire en 13. And I'm not translating that shit. This last info is something that causes confusion amongst collectors because you'll sometimes see the sword described or named as the model year 11, sometimes as model year 13. And if you are wondering what is the difference between the two, well, there is none. Because it is the same sword, but from different point of view based on dates. The year 9 is when the sword made its debut. The year 11 is when the sword was reworked and presented. And the year 13 is when that sword was officially adopted or accepted for service. So technically there should be only two terms or two designations to use. Model year 9 and the model year 13. So the sword year 13 allegedly started to be produced only after 1806, and like all new models of the Reform, underwent quality inspections by the manufacturers of Klingenthal, Versailles, and sometimes Turin. Again, I refer to my previous video to get familiar with this system of stamps and signatures. The sword was issued to the Cuirassiers regiments rather slowly because it always took time for the units to be supplied with new equipment, especially when considering that France was at war most of the time and that supplying the troops when they were far away was quite a challenge. In the years 1803 to 1806, they still used older models from the Revolutionary Wars, and the year 9 model, despite having its problems. And this is because the French liked to use their swords until they were no longer serviceable, only after were they replaced with new stock. So yes, you heard that right. During the campaigns of 1805, 1806, and 1807, they would still be equipped with a mix of obsolete older models, year 9 and year 13 Sabre. In the years 1808 and 1810, two new regiments were raised, one from Spain and the other from the Netherlands. And this brought some weird variants to the lot, some of which allegedly had iron hilts or others having entirely brass scabbards. When all 14 regiments of Cuirassiers were fully staffed and equipped correctly, it was already the year 1810. The sword wasn't exclusive to Cuirassiers. It was also issued to the dragoons, although they had a scabbard that was made of black leather and brass fittings. The two regiments of Carabiniers also were given this weapon for a short time, though they tested it in 1810 and 1811 and rejected the sword because they thought it was too heavy and hard to handle. For that, they were given a specific sword that was lighter afterwards. Some elements of the Imperial Guard cavalry could also be found wearing this sword, chiefly support units such as the Horse Gendarmerie. Today's collectors will rave about how awesome this sword really is. But did you know that, contrary to our own opinions, the Sabre wasn't that well appreciated in its beginnings? And even though the Sabre was remodeled to give strength and power, some complained that it became too heavy and hard to handle. There is even a report of an officer, a strong officer, that couldn't hold the Sabre for more than 60 seconds straight. Another negative observation was made by some unit colonels, and it was about the blade having a crappy tempering or failing the tempering test. This might explain why so many of these have 3 stamps instead of 2 in the blade. And this, the third stamp happened when the blades failed some of the tests that were made during the manufacturing process. So the third stamp was when the reviser checked the blade again and made sure that it was fit for service before being shipped to the units. So if you come across one specimen of the first generation having only 2 stamps instead of 3, it probably means that it had or has a dubious tempering. The other criticism was towards the scabbard type 2. Even if it was made stronger to deal with falls and hits, it seems it was made too strong, and so much that it was deemed dangerous for some, because if the rider fell on it at a certain angle, he would sustain serious injury. Though for others, the scabbard could damage the saddle, the shabraque, or the rider's pants. Probably to answer these critics, a new scabbard would appear somewhere in 1814 or a bit later, which was slimmer, lighter, and with the rivets being on the side instead of being in the front. And the shape of the drag would be made this time somewhat more elongated and symmetrical. This scabbard most likely met satisfaction because it would be the core design for the future models that would be made until World War I. Which brings to the topic of its time in service. The French army always had that practical mindset of using, reusing, and abusing swords, and recycling them after even the introduction of newer, better models. This happened to the year 13 sword. After 1819, the successor of the year 13 appeared, which was the model 1816, who was then replaced by the model 1822 Sabre, just a few years later. Yet, despite the existence of these two models, the Sabre year 13 was still being produced by the manufacturer of Châtellerault until at least the 1840s. This means that the manufacturer had the express order either from the state or an official entity to continue crafting an old model even though it was technically surpassed. This explains why you can find some swords having seemingly anachronistic production dates going from the 1820s to the 1840s. Another cause of great confusion was that the French really liked substituting parts between the models. Thus, a year 13 blade that was still serviceable but needing a hilt was paired with one specimen from either the models 1816 or 1854. This swap, this creation of composite swords, was done when old hilts were broken beyond repair and the models were no longer produced. And strangely enough, many year 13 blades were repaired and refitted, but mostly with 1854 hilts, very rarely with 1816 parts. This is possibly because when the year 13 hilts finally got to the end of their life, only the 1854 hilts remained in production to receive the orphaned old blades. Though this process of repairing old blades might have lasted a few years, it officially ceased in 1857, and the blades were sent back to the artillery depot for conservation or archives. One common misconception found today with this sword is about its point, as many are found with the tip having a spear point. Some claim that this was done in 1814 to make way for new regulations, but there is no existent proof that can validate this and is only based on visual examples found in museums or collections. In other words, it's all verbal. What can be used, however, is the testimony of General Marais-Monge, who reported that some units modified the back of the blades to make them more pointed for better thrusts, but never to the point of being like a spear. Other than that, the only thing that survived was an order from the French army dictating that the remaining swords of older models that were still kept in active service, would have had the tip converted to spear point to follow standardization. However, this order was from 1855. This means that the sword having the original an unmodified straight back tip were specimens that were either stored or never used or found their way within private collections. Yet those having the spear points were swords that were in service within the army during or after the 1850s. Let's see the three swords that I have to show you, one of which was made in 1813, another from the Second Restoration, and the last one being an original composite made of different parts. The first one is a textbook specimen having all the main features that make the year 13 sword: a brass hilt with 3 protective branches, the barrel-shaped pommel, a grip having 12 turns of wire, and the double-folded blade. Both the hilt and blade have markings that indicate the period of fabrication. The back of the blade has the Klingenthal signature, which appeared after 1810 when the manufacturer was required to add the month and date of production on the blades. And this inscription is read as Manufacture Impériale du Klingenthal, Novembre 1813, so November 1813. The inspection marks are found under Picasso in vertical order, one below the other. So we have a K for the inspector or director J. Kranst, who was in service from the years 1812 to 1814. B for the controller J. G. Bick, who was in service in the years 1812 to 1815. And the L for revisor F. Lobstein, who was there from 1804 to 1820. As previously said, many of these heavy cavalry blades had problems with temper, so it became regular practice to add the third stamp to verify the step. If Klingenthal had control of blade production, 50% of the hilt production could be made at the manufacturer at Versailles, which is the case here. And the quillon is stamped with the initials LF for J.B. Lefebvre, who was controller from January 1811 to December 1813. And there's a B with a star, which looks more like a P, next to the Versailles stamp, and this is for P. Bick, the revisor from July 1813 to December 1813. If you look closely, the specimen has kept its hatchet or straight back point, though it looks much more spent in its back, almost as if it was modified intentionally, but not to the fullest as to give a clear spear tip. It is possible that it could be the field modification that Marais-Monge wrote about and that I mentioned a bit earlier before. Fortunately, my specimen kept the older style year 11 big scabbard, which is pretty solid. The main feature is its lyre-shaped drag and the emplacement of the screw in the mouth. It really is heavy, almost as much as the sword itself. The second sword is basically the same thing, but the difference is in the shape of the tip and the markings. The hilt may be an older year 13 made at Versailles, but the rack numbers have been barred and replaced, indicating new service. After 1820, the inspection stamps were no longer one below the other in vertical order, but now placed in horizontal order, and RD for Inspector J.T. Dubuc from November 1823 to March 1830, and B for Controller J. Bick, who was there from May 1815 to August 1824. The blade back signature is clearly marked Manufacture Royale de Klingenthal, Juillet 1824, so July 1824. And as I said before, production of this model did not stop even after new models appeared. In 1824, the Sabre models 1816 and 1822 were already existed. Yet the markings of this blade proved that the sword year 13 was still around and kept in production line. What is also interesting is that unlike the other sword whose tip is a bit ambiguous, this one is clearly spear-pointed as per the regulations of 1855, meaning that it was in service from 1824 right up to the 1850s when the tips were converted. Last specimen is the variant that was made from different models. On the hilt, you can recognize the later model 1854, whose features I will discuss in this future. But the blade retains the characteristics, the features of the year 13 blade, having a flat back and broader width than the 1854. Its back is marked Manufacture Nationale de Châtellerault, eligible month 1849. This signature element, national, was used during the Second Republic, which lasted from 1849 to 1852. The ricasso is stamped with the inspection stamps of J for Director J. Durousseau de Fayolle, who occupied that post from September 1862 to March 1873, and B for Controller J. Biche from 1864 to 1870. The sword's hilt has just next to the rack number other inspection stamps. F, which is for Director de Fayolle, who was around since 1859 to 1862, and right next to it B, which was for J. Biche, but this time from the years 1845 to 1864. The odd thing is that the inspection stamps date from way after the blade was made. So it could be that it was taken from storage, inspected in the 1860s, and mounted on a newer hilt. This confirms the following information. 1. That the year 13 was still being produced in as late as the 1840s, and 2. That the notion of pairing older blades with new stock was a common practice, possibly even beyond the time the order was given to stop this practice. So when all this is said, how does this sword compare to other models that came before or after it? Is it as heavy and limited in its handling as some contemporary complained? No. Is it the defining best sword of all times that explains why the Cuirassiers dominated the battlefield? Also, no. It's a sword that handles well, but its big size limits some uses, such as close quarter combat. And I really wouldn't recommend using it for cuts, or cutting things. But it is far from being necessarily useless in cuts and slashes. The sword is a bit more versatile than it appears, but neither is it the super weapon that grants absolute efficiency to those who use it. The dragoons used the same weapon, but they had a different scabbard. Yet they were never as feared or remembered as their heavy brothers. Something that is a bit unfair, in my opinion. And I've already mentioned that the Cuirassiers, the Carabiniers, weren't big fans of this sword either, for handling reasons and weight. So a bit, honestly, a bit overrated in my opinion, but not that much. And there is something about this sword. There is a reason why it attracts so much attention, so much love from collectors, and that's the lore. It's the fascination that comes with this sword, and having it with the iron scabbard, because it is inevitably associated with the Cuirassiers. And this is explained. This fascination is also explained by their appearance, the psychological effect of wearing seemingly bulletproof armor, something that I will debunk in a future video. So it was the way it was used as the extension of these men, the mystical extension of their striking power, and why they were feared in the battlefield, not just because of the armor, but the way they used the sword too. The tactical skill needed to make sure that this sword was well used. And this is something I will explain a bit more. Cuirassiers were meant to charge and kill the opponent, rather than wound. This is precisely what the sword did. I would have no doubt that stabbing someone, even when wearing a cuirass, would do considerable damage because the blade is quite broad and flexible enough to penetrate, provided that the tempering was well done. And despite not designed to do slashes, moulinet could still be done just as well, though in reality the trooper was only instructed to use that technique to get out of dangerous melee situations, since the long blade would give range for distancing foes. However, it would be obviously not something to do during a charge, which makes me want to compare with the ancient Greek and Roman line formations, such as the phalanx, where the troopers had to maintain close proximity to each other. In this case, the cuirassiers needed to be heel to heel, to present as much as possible a cohesive wall of spike that the enemy would not be able to break. In such a formation, slashes would be rendered useless and counterproductive. Thus, the idea to use the point only, and why the sabre was, well, mostly designed to do just that. And it did that remarkably well when the troopers knew how to use it, for both the cuirassiers and the dragoons were able to maximize its use and deal deadly blows to their foes to secure tactical superiority in the field. One of the best examples of that professionalism was the engagement of XI-XIII that happened during the campaign of France in February 3, 1814, that opposed 2,500 Prussian cavalrymen to 1,800 French horsemen, among them 500 cuirassiers from the 4th and 5th Regiment. At one point, the Prussians rode against the French, who, surprisingly, received the charge at full halt, and even more amazingly, stopped and pushed back the Prussians, who rallied and were more successful the second time they charged. Even though they were driven off the field, the French showed exemplary self-control and professionalism that day, and they weren't even full combat veterans, so it goes to show you what they could accomplish. For such reasons, it's no wonder it was copied by so many other nations. And very few swords had such an enormous influence as the year 13 Sabre or line cavalry. We can sometimes rate the impact and the efficiency of some soldiers by the way their equipment is copied by friend or foe. And this is where French cuirassiers stand out. Their cuirass and the helmets became a sort of trademark or a fashion within armies in an international level. So did their model year 13 that would become the core designed for whole generations of continental swords of the 19th and 20th century. France's satellite states such as Bavaria, the Kingdom of Italy, and the Netherlands already manufactured or ordered heavy cavalry type swords for their troops. So when the empire fell, it was natural for them to continue production of these models, which followed the same lines as their former overlords. Even enemy nations like Prussia, Russia, and Spain made swords for their cuirassiers that were directly inspired by the French model in the years following its fall in 1850. Prussia most notably used looted weapons that were modified with markings, and when these were considered unusable, the improved replacement models were quite amazingly the same thing. And the specimen that I'm holding here looks like a common French sword, but closer inspection reveals German stamps or Prussian stamps and markings on the hilt and on the scabbard, which is for the 3rd Cuirassier, 2nd Squadron, sword number 152. So it's in fact a model 1817 of the that was made in the 1850s. So as you can see, the form is clearly the same as the one that was used 40 years ago. If it ain't broken, why fix it? And this is the end of this rather long video about this iconic sword. Iconic because it was used by the Cuirassiers and the Dragoons, men whose efforts were crucial in the making of the might of the French Empire. And for this reason, it is a prestigious piece for collectors and fetches high prices in the market, especially those having the unmodified straight back point and their scabbard type 2. While not being a perfect sword, one can understand the mighty potential that it had to offer in combat, and why it was modeled for future generations of swords. Its fundamental design was innovative enough to be used with great efficiency in the field, and as a result, it became an icon of the wars by itself. I really hope that you enjoyed this video that took considerable time to make. Next one I hope will be less time consuming and will be about the successor swords to the models year 13, which were for the light cavalry and heavy cavalry model 1816. So until then, thank you very much for your time today. See you soon.